Hello and welcome to the End of the Chain. I'm your host, Samuel McCulloch, and I want to welcome you to the 50th episode. I can't even believe it. And I've been really happy and really just thankful to be able to get to this point, to put 50 episodes in and see the growth of our wonderful listener base. Now, I would not have been able to have done this podcast without the help of some very wonderful people, most notably Cian, who helps me out a ton and does more work than I can possibly say, and really is the lifeblood of this podcast. Also, I want to thank Barbara for doing the amazing work in producing the images for the End of the Chain podcast. I'm really thankful to you both, and it means a lot that you guys have been able to come on this journey with me. I am joined by Jan Pritzker from Swan Bitcoin. This turned out to be a lively debate, and I want to thank Jan for coming on. As always, make sure to subscribe to this podcast. Share it with your mothers, brothers, sisters, and lovers, and anyone else who you think would enjoy listening to the End of the Chain. All right, that wraps it up. Let's hop into the episode. Welcome to the podcast, Jan. I'm actually really excited to have you on because 2 months ago, my wife and I, we just moved from Russia. We're back in February, actually.
Oh, cool.
And yeah, so I had been living there for 6 years. I moved there in 2013. My wife is from Tyumen in Siberia. But we met in Moscow, and we got married a couple years back, 3 years back, and then just moved here to Florida for a new job just a while back. And in my research, I mean, you're also Russian as well too.
Yep.
And you, like my wife, lived in the Soviet Union as well. When exactly did you immigrate to the United States?
Yeah, so I came over in 1989. I was 7 years old at the time and came over with my parents and my sister. But yeah, I grew up in Russia and Soviet Russia, which was a very interesting experience for sure.
I think a lot of people in the West, it's really lost on them. Even people that grew up in the United States, the views that they were getting were not really the actual, I guess, like life of living over there. And the more time that I've spent there, and more so even getting out of Moscow as well too, like living in more rural places, you start to see the differences in kind of culture and people. And it's a great place. I mean, I love Russian culture. I love Russian food. And
oh yeah.
I mean,
we still eat lots of Russian food all the time now.
Yeah. I know, it's great. But at the same time, I think I still see a lot of problems there. The country is only 30 years out of, is that right? 30 years out of communism. And I think reading about it and listening to a lot of stories from that time, the growth pains of moving from a completely like centrally controlled economy to a less centrally controlled economy has been difficult. And I know that's one of the reasons that kind of brought you into Bitcoin as well too.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because I got into Bitcoin unrelated to being from the Soviet Union, but then after I sort of studied it for a while, I circled back and started understanding what the actual purpose of Bitcoin was. Because, as somebody who, I grew up doing technology stuff, I've been doing startups for 20 years. So when I first heard about Bitcoin, I really thought about it as a technology, as a really interesting distributed systems problem that had been solved, how to get a whole bunch of computers to coordinate that didn't trust each other. And there was a lot of brilliance there in how Bitcoin is designed. And so when I first got into Bitcoin, I spent a lot of time studying decentralized and distributed networks in general, kind of the whole blockchain space, Ethereum and all these other kind of distributed projects. And then probably 6 or 8 months after doing that, I circled back to Bitcoin, just trying to understand the underlying, like, where did this all come from? And I almost by accident stumbled upon this talk by Andreas Antonopoulos called Currency Wars, where he started talking about why Bitcoin was important and how he had misread it, right? He kind of said that he originally thought of it as a remittance technology, that it would maybe compete with Western Union. And then over time, he started seeing this pattern in the world where all these governments were essentially playing games with their currencies. And we see that today, right? We see, Trump tweeting at Jay Powell, like, we need to lower our interest rates to be competitive with the rest of the world. We need to, stimulate our economy. And so they're really talking about there is currency debasements and capital controls, which is, something that's happening all over the world. Andreas spoke a lot about that and saying how people weren't able to access money out of their ATMs, and there was bank runs. People weren't allowed to leave the country with a certain amount of money. And when I understood all of that, I started understanding Bitcoin as a money for freedom, for defeating capital controls, and for allowing people to have real ownership over their money. That's really when I started asking my parents, because I'd never thought about what the Soviet life was like. I was 7 years old when I came over here, and we grew up very poor in America. We quickly got back on our feet because my parents were, thankfully they were well educated. They were engineers and teachers. It took them a while to get back on their feet, but we did. But initially we were very poor, and I never thought about why is that the case? I kind of assumed we just left, the Soviet Union with what we had. But as it turns out, when we left, my parents were able to exchange only $100 per person to leave the country with. So we left the country with $400 in our pocket. And the reason for that was capital controls, because the Soviet Union did not want, they had a fake exchange rate, just like most countries do when they have a broken currency or when they have a centrally planned economy. The government has one exchange rate, might be say 10 rubles to a dollar. And then on the street, it's really like 100 rubles to a dollar, right? Nobody actually wants that currency. So because of that, they have capital controls where they will only exchange a certain amount when you're leaving the country. And that's when I finally started tying together why Bitcoin was really important for the world. And it wasn't because it was this really interesting technology or a payment system. It was because it was a new type of money that you could actually carry out with you from a country like the Soviet Union. And that's kind of when it all came together for me.
So it kind of acts as like a digital Swiss bank account that can't be seized.
Yeah, I think of it that way, or digital gold, right? It's something, unlike those things. I mean, a Swiss bank account only can't be seized in quotes, right? I mean, given enough government intervention, all kinds of things are possible. And same thing with gold. You can't, if you're in the Soviet Union or something, you try to walk out of the country with gold in your pockets, well, you're not going to leave very far. And Bitcoin is interesting in the way that it's scarce, it's digital and it's portable. So you can put it in your head and you can just memorize, say, 24 words, which represent your private keys. And you can just walk out of a country like that. And, you have your money, you have your wealth. And that's very compelling for people living in those kinds of regimes.
One thing that happened in Russia and probably in the rest of the outer Soviet Union countries is that from the time of the collapse in 1991 up until maybe the mid 2010s, there had been a huge process of offshorization, of capital fleeing the country. Mm-hmm. There was oligarchs who had used their positions of power, essentially acting as a mafia, right? Mm-hmm. Changing from essentially a mafia boss into a legitimately, by the government standards at least, like a legitimate business owner who would control vast sums of capital and assets that were like legally through the government structure, but like in real life illegally seized and then used to enrich themselves beyond the scope of what anybody could think of.
Yeah, and I think a lot of these people had ties to the prior government, right? Like when people were in the communist Russia, when everybody was supposed to be equal, I mean, that really wasn't the case. People had special access to capital and, to business, and there was bribes everywhere that were obviously in any tightly controlled economy, there's a thriving black market because the reality is things still have to happen. And I think a lot of these folks had access to these markets when everyday people didn't, and were able to rise up.
And so over this time period, it's estimated that 50% of all of Russia's wealth has gone offshore and is now in different jurisdictions outside of the scope of the Russian government. And this is one thing that led to their big push in the middle of the 2010s for de-offshorization, to try to limit the amount of money that could flee offshore outside of the country. Mm-hmm. Do you think that the Russian government should be able to go, if it wants to and seize these offshore funds?
Well, it's a tricky thing, right? Because it's like a double-edged sword, right? You either have freedom or you don't have freedom. So,
right.
If you have freedom, like you have cash, and cash is to some degree anonymous, and you're free to move it around, well, you're going to have, criminals doing that, right? And you're also going to have everyday people doing that. Now, if we say, okay, there's two possible futures from this point on. One is, well, all money is going digital. I don't think that's probably not a contentious point. Money is becoming digital very, very rapidly. And whether that happens, tomorrow or, in 2 generations, it's going to happen at some point. The vast majority of payments over, in the world are starting to become digital anyway. So when money goes fully digital, what kind of world do we want? And so one answer to that is we want to have a world where every payment is tracked, traced, surveilled, right? And that's what banks and governments want, and they push for that. And we have papers coming out of the IMF and other banking entities that say, look, when we get to digital money, and especially central bank digital money, where we have no intermediaries, we can trace everything. And that's really great. We can stop terrorism and drugs and child porn and all that kind of stuff, offshoring of oligarch money, right? But what does that mean for the average person, right? Because we have to remember that criminals are a very, very, very small proportion of the general population. So what we're saying is, in order to stop these, 10 guys who have offshored millions of dollars, we're going to track and surveil everybody's payments. And that really leads to very totalitarian regimes. And we already see examples of that. I mean, look at China. They have a social credit system where they're monitoring what people are doing. Then they can, push them out of the system and say, okay, now you can't buy train tickets because you smoked on a train. Is that really the society we want? Or do we want a society where people have freedom with their money? And yes, freedom with money, it does mean that there will be criminals that are also free with that money. But criminals are also free with the internet, right? And there's always been criminals throughout history. We've always stopped some of them, not all of them. It's just a question of trade-offs. So for me, saying that all money should be surveilled and tracked, and we should have the option to press a button and cut, a person out of the system or cut an entire country out of the system, that is a bad trade-off to make, because we're really just saying we're going to take everybody's freedom away. And just look at the Soviet Union. People were just not able to leave because they couldn't take their money with them. And that's what that means when you have capital controls and you have surveillance and you give the state so much power. You're really saying people should be stuck in whatever country they're stuck in, and they can't leave because they can't take their money, and they can't buy the things that they need to because those things are illegal, because their government has decided that. I don't like that society at all, and that's not the trade-off that I would make.
When the Ukrainian government fell back in 2016,
I didn't follow Ukrainian. I'm actually from Ukraine. I'm from Kiev, but I have not followed modern Ukrainian history really, other than what I've heard on the news with, things going down. But I'm not ethnically Ukrainian, so I don't really have any ties to the country anymore. There's no family there for me.
Mm-hmm. Yanukovych, that's the guy. Okay. So in 2000,
he was like a Putin guy, right? He was like a Putin.
Pro Russia, right? I mean, like, look, yeah. all these things are very. It's too easily, it's too easily a gray area, right? Because to say that somebody is pro-European, pro-Russian, it really comes down to the geopolitics of how the natural gas and oil is passing through Ukraine and who's benefiting from that. Because it really doesn't matter. And you saw this after the fall of Yanukovych, right? It really didn't matter who was in place. It just matters more about who is on top to be able to reap the profits from the industry and benefit their friends in these types of governments. It's wrong for Americans to think that the Russian government, or maybe not the Russian government, but that the Ukrainian government or the Russian government or any of these former Soviet states work in the same way that the American government does, and that it has the same level of transparency and the same level of ability to protest and investigate the government itself. It doesn't work like that. After the fall of Yanukovych, there was this really amazing scene where people from Kiev walked over to his residence at the Mezhyria residence. And this was his dacha that was outside of the city. And nobody actually knew that he lived there. It wasn't on the government records that he lived there. It was completely surrounded by a giant fence. And this hundreds of millions of dollar residence was unknown to the people who actually lived in the city. And the reason is that he was able to obscure the ownership records of his dacha by having a British company, a British shell company that was owned by a trust or some sort of other structure the shell company was able to purchase this piece of property and then own the dacha as a foreign investor. So the Ukrainian president was able to funnel hundreds of millions of dollars through these types of shell companies and into building residences like these without anyone in the government knowing. And
it's
this
so
was
funny
all,
you call it a dacha, because for me that word means like a cabin that we built by hand out of wood, because that's what our dacha was like, and his is $100 million residence.
And so no one knew this, and the only reason that anyone found out about his ownership of his house and also his offshore ownership records was that when he had to leave in quite a hurry when the revolution happened, and during that time period he did not have time to burn all of his records, and so his assistants were trying to clear out his dacha, and so they threw all of his files into the lake in front of his dacha. And so when the protesters showed up at his house, they walked through the house, they kind of found all the guns and the animals and the gold and everything else. But then they came across the lake, and inside the lake were all of his records. And they just were laying there in the water. I mean, they were wet. They were able to take them out. And only through this kind of luck of being able to the luck in finding these records in the lake, were they able to find his full ownership records outside of Ukraine, and then through international courts seize those assets and then bring them back into ownership by either the government or other people within the state. So this function of justice, of seizure, would not be possible with somebody who controlled their own private keys. So if he had a private key, right, where unless they'd been discovered through, like I said, somebody finding it in a lake, let's say he had $1 billion in Bitcoin,
Sure.
right, that was legally belonged to the Ukrainian populace. There's no way to seize that, right? And so while you call that a benefit, don't you think that's a inability of democracy to function?
Well, I mean, okay, sure. There's that. Again, it's trade-offs, right? I'm not claiming that Bitcoin is perfect. The question is, what's the trade-off? Okay, so the guy stole, $1 billion from the nation in whatever way. Okay, but are we willing to trade off like the entire nation's freedom for that? Because that's really what you're saying, right? You're saying governments that are able to do, stop transactions with a click of a button, they're the ones that are abusing their people's freedom, their citizens. Like, do you want to live in a Chinese type of environment? Now, some people do, right? Some people think China is a great example of a functioning state. I mean, I don't personally, but they've been able to accomplish great things, right? Authoritarian governments accomplish great things because they don't have any checks and balances, right? And they can abuse their populace. They can, lock up millions of people in concentration camp, and that's fine. But they can build great things. So to me, that's a bad trade-off to make. So I would rather have this guy get away with stealing $1 billion and have people have their freedom than lock up everybody else because we have to trace these criminals. We've had criminals since the beginning of time, right? I mean, there's always been criminals, and process the crime, right? What did he do? Did he kill somebody? Put him in jail. Did he steal something? Put him in jail. Okay, you process the guy. As far as seizing money is money, right? Governments print money left and right. Money is nothing to them. So I'd rather have people be safe and have their freedom than have this fully digital world where anybody can just price or take you out of the financial system with a click of a button. That's just very scary.
Well, I think it's a common misconception that governments print money, right? But most money is printed through the private banking structure in the form of loans and other debt instruments.
Well, sure. Okay. I mean, yes, banks create money through the creation of credit, of course. But governments also, or central banks, manipulate the price of money, right, by changing
So coming back to what you're saying here, what I'm saying is that in a democratic society, I'm just going to take the United States as an example. We have the best system that we are able to come to as agreed upon through hundreds of years of a functioning democratic process. Would you agree with that?
I think it's pretty good. I think it could be better. Obviously, it's better than the Soviet Union.
Yeah.
And I think one of the reasons that we're so good is because of the checks and balances in our system, right? We have an inefficient system of government compared to an authoritarian government or a monarchy or something like that. Like, things don't get done. We have Congress in gridlock all the time, right? But that's a good thing. That's why our system is actually resistant to tyranny.
Exactly. I mean, that's how the system was designed, is so that things would be slow and it would take a long time and it would have to go through many different committees, and things just wouldn't be passed in one day, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a system that actually requires consensus building rather than, tyrannical kind of top-down command, right?
Right. So in a democratic society,
in theory,
right? So we have a pretty well-functioning democratic society, and from that democratic society, we've had a money system that has evolved through hundreds of years, from relying on gold to essentially turning into a credit-based system. And that's all been the product of evolution through the democratic process.
mm-hmm.
So part of that is that, yes, it may not be the best, right? But it's something that we've come to a democratic agreement on, where we've had broad consensus among voters who are putting the politicians into positions of power to make these decisions about how the money structure should be created. So that's done.
Although I will say that I think this system has been changing rapidly under our feet without necessarily, it's not like we oversee every single thing that the governments or the banks do. Like, for example, the digitization of money has happened almost naturally, not because we voted it in. We didn't all say, okay, we're going to digitize all of our money. It's just happening through convenience. Like, we're all using Visa and PayPal and Apple Pay, not because we voted those things in. It's because they're convenient and we started using them. But as a result, our system has become almost entirely digital, which presents a new set of problems, which weren't things that we designed for. It's just things that evolved.
One of the parts of having a like free and open democratic process where anybody can come and put their ideas forward is that we have also have a strong set of rules where if someone steals money from me, I can typically, it's actually, as long as they don't steal Bitcoin from me, it's really relatively easy for me to go and have that money returned. I just go file a police report. The police go through the banks. They can see all the transactions. And then after a judge rules that money should be returned to me, the banks remove the money from the person's account or their assets are seized. And then I'm returned my funds. And so that aspect of justice is something that doesn't exist within Bitcoin. Where
we also have rampant civil asset forfeiture abuse, right? Because of those things. So there's also that. Again, there's trade-offs to every system, right? Yes, you can have a system like that, and yes, it can be also abused. But also, I don't understand why Bitcoin isn't compatible with that. I mean, if a judge wants to say, you owe $100 million back or you're going to jail, well, if you don't produce it in Bitcoin or otherwise, you're going to jail, right? You can still enforce laws by jailing people, which is what governments do, and they're really good at that.
What if the person's gone overseas? Left the country?
What happens today when a person's gone overseas?
Well, I mean, it's hard. It doesn't work easily. I mean, like, let's say that someone has stolen $100,000 from you and then flees to, I don't know, let's just say somewhere in Southeast Asia, right? You go to your local cop, right? And you say, hey, I've had this $100,000 stolen from me. Can you go, and he did it in Bitcoin. Can you go and find them and prosecute them? So that local cop, let's just say that the person ran away to, say, I don't know, like Mauritius.
I see what you're saying. I mean, it's very difficult to get at those people. But
he can't, when that local cop calls up the Mauritius police and is like, hey, we just got this report of a crime. This person's in your country now. That other country is probably going to go, okay, great. Like, now what? They don't, it's difficult for this intranational.
I hear you, of course. But look, again, it's trade-offs, right? We can't design a perfect system. So here's the question, right? Like, before 9/11 happened, we didn't really have the TSA. Everybody could walk up to the terminal. We didn't have any of that, right? Now everybody goes through pat downs, takes off their shoes, all this other stuff. So we've added this, let's call it a freedom tax. We've added a freedom tax to go into the airport in order to stop a certain percentage of, terrorist acts. Now, I don't know if anybody remembers, people who are, 18 years old today don't remember a world without the TSA. They don't even know why they take their shoes off. They don't know about the shoe bomber. None of this stuff, right? It just enters into our culture. So now, okay, going to the airport requires you to go through a full body search, and then eventually it gets worse and worse, right? So we've given up a certain amount of freedom to have protection from these terrorist acts. Okay, so here's the question. is that the right thing to have done, right? Is it okay to give up that freedom because we want to be protected from a 1 in a million occurrence? And some people will say yes, right? And this is the difference between people who I would say prefer safety over freedom and people who prefer freedom over safety, right? For example, for me, I would rather not have the TSA. I would rather not be patted down. I'd rather not have people going through that. And, I think that the TSA is a very minor infringement on our rights, whereas something like a Chinese social credit system is a very major infringement on our rights. So you have to balance those things with what
Jan,
are you trying to stop, right?
But Jan, you're Jewish, right?
Yeah.
Have you flown to Israel before? Flown
yes.
in and out?
I've had interviews with guys with machine guns. Yes, I have done all of those things.
How much of a difference is the US structure for flying versus the Israeli?
I mean, the Israeli one is way tighter and probably a lot more effective. And they do profiling, by the way, which, if you're going to do a system like this, you might as well do that, which Americans are not going to do.
So, but can you walk me through like what happens? Like how early do you have to go to the airport when you're flying from Israel?
Oh, I don't remember. I did this when it was like 10 years ago. I know it's a few hours extra for sure.
Yeah, but when you get to the airport, they like ask you questions and they're like...
Yeah, they interview you. They ask me like... they asked me like what Jewish holidays to celebrate and all kinds of stuff like that. They got really deep, and I was a very bad Jew at that time. I was like, I don't know. And they were like, name 4 Jewish holidays. I was like, Hanukkah.
It's a measured response to the amount of violence that's taking place in the country.
Yes, I agree with you. Look, again, of course, you respond to what you need to. There are trade-offs to everything. I'm not going to pretend that Bitcoin is a solution to all the world's problems, but let's just take a step back and zoom out and say, what is it that, where are all these problems actually coming from? Like, where is terrorism actually coming from, right? You might want to zoom out and say, okay, terrorism might be a problem of these quote unquote, liberal democracies oppressing other people and bombing the shit out of them all the time. That might be a problem. That might be causing the terrorism, right? Why are they doing that? Why are they waging war? Is it because they need to have control over the oil supply? Is it because they need to have control over their money? Is it because they're taking entire countries out of the system using sanctions? Like, what is the root cause of all of this? And if you zoom out far enough, money is the root cause of all of these problems. And having no freedom with your money is the root cause of a lot of these problems. It's the root cause of poverty, right? Debt. Like, I've just started reading the book called Debt, the First 5,000 Years. Why are all these societies impoverished? It's because they're in debt to countries like the United States. Like, all of this stuff comes from money. So zoom out far enough and you see that that's the solution to all these problems. And again, I'm not suggesting that tomorrow we replace all our entire financial system with Bitcoin and everything's just going to be fine. Of course it's not. But to people that are living in circumstances where they have actual oppression, actual lack of freedom, the ability to start saving a small pot of Bitcoin on the side in order to escape that oppression is a huge deal. And I don't think states are going away anytime soon. I don't think any of this, enforcement's going away. It's just giving people another option that's in parallel to that.
So I have a slightly different view on Bitcoin. I'm like, I like it. I hold it. But my belief is that Satoshi was going down a different rabbit hole than he should have at the time in 2008. And the problem in 2008, and it's still a problem now, is that there's a large portion of the world which doesn't have good access to dollars. And because of this dollar shortage that exists in countries like Russia and Venezuela and other places where you have a local currency which is losing value against the dollar year on year on year, there's just not enough offshore dollars to meet the demand of these international countries. And so I think Bitcoin was in a naive way, a way for people to be able to access some sort of dollarization in the beginning to act as a hedge or just to access this international capital. And I think this view existed for a long time. But one thing that's really kind of changed my thoughts on all of this over the past since 2018 really is the growth and the just sheer demand for the stablecoin markets in Tether, in USDC, in Libra, and whatever else is coming, CBDCs, in the just huge desire for people in China, in Russia, in other places of the world that don't have good access to United States banking system, to be able to access US dollars and then use them for trade, commerce, paying salaries, whatever they need to.
Mm-hmm. I would agree that that's a problem today. I would dispute that that should be the way that the world works. I don't think the United States should be the bank of the world. I don't think the US dollar, like why do we get the special privilege of, basically dollars are gold today, right? If you really look at it, dollars, despite the fact that some of us Bitcoiners will say that we're printing rampant amounts of dollars, dollars are actually the only scarce currency in the world. Every other currency is to some degree traded against it or pegged to it or whatever, right? Everybody wants dollars. And you're right, there's a dollar shortage across the world. So, but why, right? Why this is all a historical accident. It's all because of World War II. It's all because of Bretton Woods. Why did we put this one country in charge of the world's money supply? That's really messed up. It really requires a lot of faith in the United States not to screw that system up. And I don't have that faith, honestly. I mean, look at what's happening today. If you still have faith in how our central banks work after all of this, I mean, look, people will dispute what's actually going on, right? The coronavirus caused massive deflation, or were we actually, did we create a massive asset bubble since 2008 because of the liquidity injections that we did back then? There's different views on that, but why should one room of people in the United States control the entire world's money supply? And you have countries asking this already.
Well, they don't, but the Fed doesn't. Right.
I get that. Right. Sure. There's euro dollars. There's stuff being created all over the world. Right. I mean, if you want to,
so the euro dollar system is a much bigger system than the dollar, and that exists in completely outside of the control of the U.S. Federal Reserve.
I understand that, but again, it's all to some degree dollar based, right? So, I mean, it's denominated in dollars. At the end of the day, if somebody wants physical cash, it has to come from the United States, from the Treasury. Unless it all goes digital, and then there's no meaning to the word dollar anymore, right?
Right, but how does I guess my question would be if you're switching out M0 of dollars into Bitcoin, right? But you still have a credit-based system of banking on top. What exactly changes?
I'm not suggesting replacing the world's, I don't know, dollar supply with Bitcoin. I look at Bitcoin as something that people can opt into. So perhaps the dollar remains the world currency until, the American empire collapses. And maybe that doesn't happen for the next 500 years. Fine. But people should have the option to take their wealth out of their country. And that's really what it comes down to for me. And that's where I look at Bitcoin as a supplement to whatever else you have going on. If you live in a country where your currency is completely, unusable, then you have two options. Either you try to get dollars, whether those are digital dollars in some stable coin type fashion, and you hope that those stable coins are still, not regulated enough so that you can move them around. And, it's not like if you're in Iran that you can be shut out of the entire stablecoin system, right, by the US government. But if you need to move out of those regimes, then you should have Bitcoin. That's what it's for, right? It's for defeating capital controls. That's how I see it. I don't necessarily see it replacing the entire world's money supply, although I would say that, going back to our conversation about why should the United States control the entire world, you already have this problem, right? The United States shuts out an entire country from the banking system. It'll just say, okay, Iran, you guys are bad guys. Sorry, no more access to dollars. Venezuela, no more access to dollars until we have your oil, like whatever, right? We can just set the terms however we want. So when we do those things, and we already see this, all these other countries, which let's call them, axis of evil countries if we want to be political about it, but the Irans and Venezuelas and Chinas and Russias of the world, they don't want to have anything to do with the US dollar. They want to have their own system, and they're already looking at how to settle trades between each other. And you have stories every day coming out. Okay, now they're shipping 9 tons of gold to each other. That's what they're going back to. They're going back to shipping 9 tons of gold instead of clicking a button and sending Bitcoin. So at some point, these countries, they can't trust each other and can't trust the United States. They're going to have to come up with some other way of settling trades. And Bitcoin's just not there yet today. It's not big enough for them. But at the point where it is big enough, that could be a viable option for them. And perhaps if they can fix their trade and not be as reliant on the US dollar anymore, maybe they won't be quite as so evil anymore, right? I mean, again, zoom out. What is the root cause of all of this strife in the world? We forget where we live. We live in an empire. We are the dominant empire of the world, and everybody else is suffering under this empire. So They don't like it.
I wouldn't
as much.
think so. I mean, I like having just spent 6 years living in Russia. I mean, I much prefer living in the United States.
Right, of course. And I'm sure Romans loved living in the Roman Empire too, right? I mean, we're in a bubble, right? We love, I mean, I love America. Look, I would rather not live anywhere else. I agree with you.
Yeah.
But look at it from the perspective of Iran, who got shut out of our system, right? Look at it from the perspective of a country that has been sanctioned by the United States. Because the government might be, quote unquote evil, but the people there aren't. They're regular people. They're trying to live their lives. And shutting them out of the dollar system, that's really horrible. So that's really what I'm talking about. We're taking people's freedom away when we do that.
My kind of general thoughts is that it pretty much always has been, is that like Bitcoin and all the other cryptos exist as a means of gap finance. So like you said, people in Iran and other places that aren't able to access European or US banking systems, we're starting to see this with the emergence of DeFi, the ability to access well-functioning dollar financial systems outside of the United States and not under the control of the United States. One thing that's really been catalyzed into me from the growth of DAI and seeing the use case of DeFi on Ethereum is that maybe Bitcoin isn't supposed to be used as a payment tool in itself, just for like daily transactions, but rather it's supposed to be the electricity or the oil that creates the functioning decentralized economy on top of it through the creation of a synthetic dollar. This is coming to Bitcoin at some point where people will be able to create dollars from their BTC as a collateralized loan. But it makes much more sense to have a low volatility form of payment to use for cross-border transactions, for trade, for paying salaries, rather than depending on a highly volatile currency or highly volatile crypto asset.
I mean, yes, in that the dollar is less volatile than Bitcoin, obviously. And remember that the lack of that volatility, the lack of short-term volatility, is traded off by systemic instability, like the current, crash of this current bubble, right? Because central banks, I mean, it's like Nassim Taleb says, you can't suppress volatility, right? You can hide it in the short term, but then it comes out in the long term. So, how long does the system last? In the short term, I completely agree with you. People would rather have dollars than Bitcoin for the most part. People who really need Bitcoin are people who, again, look at what these stable coins are. I mean, Tether, right? If you are in Iran, how do you get out of Iran? How do you interact with the Tether system? I don't know the answer to that. Maybe they can.
There's OTC places. So like,
okay. But when the government says, when they sanction Iran and they say they can't access, these entities are not allowed to use Tether, doesn't Tether have to check entities for, aren't they responsible for those AML and KYC checks?
I mean, Tether doesn't deal with U.S. citizens. Tether doesn't deal with U.S. citizens.
Let me rephrase my question. My question would be, as long as you're in Tether and it's this kind of digital thing and you're passing it around, everything seems fine. What happens when you need to access actual dollars from that Tether liquidity? And how long is the government going to allow people to pass around synthetic dollars between terrorist entities? That's the question.
That's a really good question. I mean, I'd like to know that as well too.
Because I think as long as it's small, they don't care. It's just too small to care right now. Once we have trillions of dollars moving through Tether, people might start to wake up to it.
I mean, $10 billion is a lot already.
No, it's not. I mean, not in the financial world. I mean, $10 billion is nothing.
I mean, for a privatized synthetic dollar, I mean, it's pretty big. But the way that Tether works is that, let's say you're a Russian billionaire, right? So you call up the Tether guys and you're like, hey, I need $50 million in Tether. Can you just give it to me? And they're like, sure. And then they mint $50 million in Tether, and then they send it off to you. This is why when you look at the Tether creation flows, it's always in like $100 million here, $50 million here, $80 million there. It's always because there's either companies or individuals who are very wealthy who contact the Tether group and then ask for that issuance of that.
Yeah, from my understanding, it's mostly cryptocurrency exchanges that are causing the creation of that Tether.
Well, they are asking for the creation of Tether because they know how much demand there is. Mm-hmm. So they try to stay ahead of it. But then in addition to that, if you're a very wealthy person and the Tether group of people, you can call them up and ask them to create money for you.
So you're telling me they're doing this without any anti-money laundering checks or KYC checks on like people from Iran or Russia or something like that? That's what Tether is doing today?
I can't answer that question. I just know that if you're
that seems very unlikely. I mean, they're still a company, and they still operate in the world where the United States has total control over the financial system. I'm sure they have some type of oversight there.
But if you're Russian, I mean, as long as you're not on a sanction, I mean, the Russian sanction list is pretty small. It's limited to the government. So as long as you're outside the government and you're a private citizen, typically you can go and access capital like this. Yeah.
Yeah, sure. I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, that's fine. I have no issue with any of this stuff. And I agree with you that in the short term, people want dollars. I guess my bigger question is,
but look,
is that the right system for the world long term? And should people have access to something that's entirely outside of the financial system that isn't under anybody's control?
I mean, Tether's outside the financial system, right?
Well, but Tether is a company. So it is under Tether's corporation's control, and it is to some degree, not to some degree, but it's entirely based on the trust that they have some kind of dollars in their bank account backing those synthetic dollars.
Well, let's just take a step back. So like other than Tether, you have like DAI, right? And so DAI, like a DAI equivalent is eventually going to come to Bitcoin.
It's possible. DAI has its own set of problems in that it is based on Ethereum, which has its own set of problems. So there's that.
It's more about the general idea of having a crypto asset, a digital asset that you use to take a synthetic dollar-based collateralized loan. And it doesn't have to be even dollar-based. It could be euro-based, or it could be a basket of currency-based. But really, it's just you have a more volatile asset, digital asset that you're using to generate a less volatile, stable asset.
Yeah, but we agree that there's no magic in the stability of the dollar, right? The dollar is stable because of the United States and because it's widely used in commerce and, all those kinds of things, right?
Yeah.
It's not like it's magically stable because it's the dollar. So,
but for the moment, it's the most stable. So we're talking like, I don't know what's going to happen over the next 50 years, right? So there could be the yuan that replaces it, or it could be some other type of thing. So who knows, right? But for now, the flows towards stability, right? When people talk about moving their money away from risky assets into pretty much like non-risky assets, they're talking about moving away into like dollars and treasury bonds.
Yeah, I think that's accurate. Again, I would agree with you in the short term. I would disagree in the long term. And, the reason for that would be something like, what are we actually protecting against when we buy Bitcoin? We're protecting against the dollar itself being broken. So as long as you think the dollar is not broken and it's fine and, it's stable, then you should absolutely get dollars in whatever form you can. And if synthetic dollars work for you, it helps you, get out of your situation in an oppressive regime, great. I don't have any strong opinion on that. I guess my opinion is really on Bitcoin for the long term. And when I accumulate Bitcoin, it's not for myself. It's for my children. It's for my grandchildren. It's for the possibility that the US dollar is actually broken and we just don't know it yet. It's for the possibility that the world financial system is broken and we just don't know it yet. It's for the possibility that America will one day decide not to let people leave and implement some type of capital controls because the dollar will become broken, just like has happened in in lots of countries all over the world. Maybe America's immune to that. Maybe it is. And I pray every day that we're completely immune to all the insanity that went down to the Soviet Union, Venezuela, Iran, Argentina, you name it. I hope that I'm wrong, but Bitcoin's a nice little thing to have on the side just in case those things come true.
I hope the dollar stays strong forever. I mean,
I hope the American empire lasts for the next 2,000 years, but do I know that that's the case? No, I don't.
Because because when things fall, there's a lot of calamity and chaos. People suffer.
Yeah,
there's a lot of death, and it's really bad. So I really pray that our system is able to stay functioning and healthy for a long.
One thing time. that gives me pause and concern is, we talked about America. Why is America so good? It's because our government is decentralized. It's actually the decentralization and the 3-branch, checks and balances system that makes American government good, right? But I would argue that those checks and balances are less effective if the state, has strong control over money. Here's an example, right? Like just small example. Cannabis is legal here in Illinois. Now, can I go there to the cannabis shop and use my Visa card or Apple Pay? No, I can't because they're digital systems and cannabis is still federally illegal, right? So that's a small way that the government controls my freedom. If I can't spend my money in the way that I want, then I don't have that voice, right? So the question is, the government is decentralized to some degree, but they still have a very tight control over the money. And when it comes down to it, and when scary things happen in the world, like coronavirus or terrorism or whatever, then we all run back to Uncle Sam and we ask them to, fix the problem, right? Give us more money, give us more stimulus payments, give us this and this and that. And they have the button, okay? Despite that you might want to say, yeah, there's credit creation. That's how money gets created for the most part. Well, there's also $3 trillion being borrowed by Congress in order to pay out stimulus payments, right? Those things are also how money gets created. And so as long as we let government have the control of our money, then it's not really fully decentralized. And I would argue that the strength of the American government being decentralized in the way that it is could be even stronger if money is also decentralized, if they don't have control of the money, if money is more like gold, like it used to be. I mean, we had a fully functioning government with a gold standard, and for millennia we had governments and we had gold, and occasionally we had bouts of fiat, usually to finance wars. But most of the time we had a functioning system of money where the government didn't control the money, right? So they weren't able to arbitrarily create more of it.
So this pandemic, right, is a one-time exogenous event where...
Is it one time? What happened in 2008? What happened in 2000? The tech bubble. I mean, it's just a trigger.
But I'm talking about like the actual event, right? It's where you have an entire reduction in global aggregate demand at the same time, where pretty much every country on earth is going into some lockdown for several months, where industry is being shut down. I mean, these are not normal events, right? This is not...
I would agree they're not normal. I don't know if they're one time. I mean, why wouldn't this happen again?
Like another pandemic.
Yeah, why wouldn't we have another pandemic
20
years from now?
Well, we would be more prepared for it, right?
Sure.
So,
and we would do what? Shut down the economy again? I mean,
no, it's just there would be better response. So I think, China had ample time to respond to the virus to prevent it from spreading.
Yeah, and part of the reason of that is because they have a highly totalitarian government and they were able to implement like soldiers on the street walking around with guns.
Right.
Right. So that could be one way we respond to future pandemics, to make it really effective to stop them.
Right.
If that's the way we want it to go.
But at the next outbreak, don't you think people will overreact? I think for the next, you'll see if the next virus outbreaks that happen in the next 30 to 50 years, you'll see huge overreactions as people do not want another 2020 happening again.
Yeah, potentially. Right.
Yeah, so all these things. I mean, what's scary to me, so I come from when I was younger, I was in the Marines and I worked as a Russian linguist. And then since there was no Russians in Iraq at the time, I got transferred into being a signals intelligence analyst. And primarily what we did is we looked at metadata to build analytical cases against people. So we'd look at all the information that you're generating, the thousands of, then it was a lot less metadata. Now we generate billions of points of metadata every single day that tell our entire life story. And for me, it's been the growth. The thing that really worries me is the growth of the surveillance industry with our own consent, and not just from the government side, but also on the corporate side as well too, where every single device that we use, program that we use, is really designed to track our use and to track our attention and to to just track us so that they can have better statistics on how they can market products to us or design better things.
Yeah, it's somewhat scary.
Yeah. And I
don't know if have you watched Westworld on HBO?
No.
You should absolutely check out the series. It really plays out where this goes. Like it's very dystopian and sci-fi, obviously, but it plays out kind of where the society is going. It's kind of close to home. It's worth watching though.
So one thing that we had was like full access to these like huge top secret databases that had billions of points of metadata on individuals. And a lot of this information was released in the Snowden files I think he released in 2008 or something. It was right. Like he released like a year or two after I got out. So I think maybe 2009 or something. And a lot of information about some of the databases that I was using. And so when I came into Bitcoin for the first time, when it was like $5, the thing that was so interesting to me was that how you could have a huge public database with all this metadata just out there waiting for someone else, whether it's a government or whether it's a private company or anything else, to take that metadata and then pair it with identifying information to build an analytical report, like in this case, be a financial analytical report on the person being targeted. And I've asked this question to a couple of people that have come on the show before, but do you think that with all the advances that we've seen since the publishing of the Bitcoin white papers, so the development of like ZK snarks and some of the other privacy preserving features, do you think that if Satoshi had access to these privacy features and advances in 2020 versus 2008 when he created Bitcoin, that he would have included a greater level of transactional privacy into Bitcoin itself?
I'm not sure. It's hard to say. I mean, obviously, I don't know his motivations, but one thing we do know is, the message he embedded into the first block was related to the bailouts of 2008. It wasn't really about privacy or anything else. Mm-hmm. It seems to me like he was talking about the sanctity of money as a scarce good, as a something, he was very much into this whole idea of digital scarcity. And I think potentially what was more important to him was having a sound money, an auditable money supply and things like that. Again, I'm just guessing. There's no way. This is speculation, obviously. Yeah. There's no way to know what he wanted. With a lot of these privacy technologies, there's a certain trade-off with auditability. That said, Bitcoin, if the base layer is scarce, then other things could be more private. So, for example, Lightning Network payments could be more private. You could do transactions on Liquid sidechain with confidential transactions there. So there is other second layers that could be more private if needed. The other thing I would say is that even on the base layer, when you're transacting, we're seeing the rise of CoinJoin, which is people essentially mixing their coins with other transactions. There's something called PayJoin, which just came out from BTC Pay Server. So if you pay somebody who's running a shop on BTC Pay Server, your coins are mixed together with the merchant. So as these things start becoming more and more popular, they kind of create a certain amount of herd immunity because most transactions start to look kind of messy and hard to trace. And I would also say that Bitcoin is, yes, it's totally public and transparent, but it's also pseudonymous. So in that sense, it's way better than, using PayPal or Apple Pay or something like that, where there definitely is a tie between your identity and the transaction you made, versus PayPal, where that tie could probably be uncovered if you dig far enough and, really go through subpoena records from ISPs and figure out your IP address and all this kind of stuff. You could probably get to the identity, but it's a lot harder than your typical current electronic money. And I think the way that
because think about it like this, right? In the future, right, or maybe even now, is that the U.S. government and all the other EU governments or whoever's on the FATF rules, or whoever's involved with FATF, they are essentially demanding from any on-ramp that they should have a full access to all the person's KYC information, their deposits, their withdrawals, and all of this information needs to be shared between all exchanges. Mm-hmm. So if you kind of extrapolate into the future, any on-ramp that will exist in any capacity in the future will be sharing information with governments and then also any other exchanges.
Of course. But there's, once the coins come off of the exchange, you can mix them, you can do whatever you want with them, and you have plausible deniability. It's pretty tough to say that you haven't lost those keys in a boating accident, right? There's that. So yes, they're identifying information. There's also peer-to-peer exchanges now that, like BISC or something like that, where there's less of that involved. So, the more people press on, this is a phrase I really like from Andreas Antonopoulos, who again was kind of my on-ramp into Bitcoin, that these efforts, the KYC and AML, they catch the innocent and the idiots for the most part. Criminals are good enough to walk around this stuff as needed. And most people they're just trying to get their business done. So
like coming from a intelligence background, like it is impossible for you to be completely secure with your information. You will mess up.
Of course, I agree with you. I'm not disagreeing on that. I'm just saying is this like, what's better? Is it better to have some amount of anonymity, or is it better to have, things like Equifax where everybody's information is stored and then a hacker gets 140 million people's worth of identity information in one go? And to me, the world where things are slightly more obscured is better. I don't think perfect privacy is, as you are pointing out correctly, is almost damn near impossible.
Yeah.
Right. I agree with you. To have a trail that's totally clean, to have coins that have never touched KYC, that have been mixed properly, you never logged into any centralized place. Yeah,
mine yourself.
you got to mine them yourself. You have to mix them. You have to be on a VPN all your life, on Tor, I don't know what, and maybe never even associate your name with Bitcoin like I have online, right? I get that, of course, but what's I prefer the world where you get to transact and not leave a trace in terms of your name and stuff like that in centralized databases, because we're seeing every day people's identity data be stolen and used for nefarious purposes. Everything we do and decide has a trade-off, and using these centralized systems, it has a trade-off that your identity information is fully public. And that's why I actually think the KYC and everything else on the exchanges is horrible, absolutely horrible. You're just leaving giant honeypots for hackers, and that's where people's money will actually get stolen. And that's where people's lives will actually get destroyed because of the KYC we did, not because we didn't stop some 1% of actual criminals. So that's how I feel about that. I think it's a very, very lopsided system that tries to stop crime at the expense of actually creating more crime, opportunities for crime.
Yeah. Well, I think it's probably a good point to wrap up on. You want to talk about Swan for a bit, and
sure,
we can wrap up?
This has been a very lively debate. So yeah, Swan is at swanbitcoin.com, and we are a Bitcoin on-ramp. So we help you buy Bitcoin directly from your bank account, and we do it on a recurring basis because we believe that everybody should be building a small pot of Bitcoin on a recurring basis, just like they do. They save for their house, for their mortgage, for their 401k. We want Bitcoin to be that third bucket. So you save a little bit for your house, a little bit for your 401k, and a little bit for your Bitcoin stash. And we make that easy with recurring purchases. And then we also have automated withdrawals to your Bitcoin wallet. So you can either leave it in custody with a licensed and regulated custodian. And yes, we do KYC. Just like you pointed out, I have to identify our customers begrudgingly. But after that, you can withdraw to your own wallet. And we also have a team of educators and podcasters. So we've created lots of content to help people new to Bitcoin understand what Bitcoin's all about, why they should be saving some, and how to use it.
Well, that's great. Jan, thank you so much for this discussion. I really enjoyed it.
Thanks for having me on, Sam. That was great.